My name is Mike Bullis. I have the privilege of serving as the Dean of the College of Education, and it is my honor and joy to welcome you all here for this talk. While I might be a Dean of Education, I don't know much about reading, to be very honest. One of my children picked up a book and began to read literally overnight. The other one of my children struggled mightily to learn to read. And in those 3 or 4 years where she was struggling to grasp the written word, it became very clear to me that reading is both an art and a mystery. And there are certainly people who are trying to unlock that mystery, and some, like our speaker today, has a handle on that mystery. My grandmother was a teacher all her life. She was the last teacher in the state of Illinois to be certified with a high school degree. And as a young boy, when I would work on our family farm in southern Illinois during the harvest season, the hired men who worked at the Killian farm, if they couldn't read, they were tutored by Frances Lutile Killian in how to read the written word, because she felt very strongly that reading was the key to both educational and life success. The old saying that you learn to read until 3rd grade, and after 3rd grade you read to learn, is very, very important. Reading is complicated, and mightily so, when English is not your first language and the culture you're in is English dominated. We are addressing this issue, and all of you are addressing this issue here, because in our county, in the past 6 years alone, we have had an almost 600% increase of students who claim a language other than English as their first language. You all are struggling to teach those kids educational skills, in particular reading. So we are very fortunate to have Dr. Jeanette Klingner here to speak to you today for about 45 minutes, and then we'll take questions for about 15 to 20 minutes. And I believe that you're very sincere in asking for questions. Jeanette received her PhD from the University of Miami and has been professor at the University of Colorado Boulder since 2001. She is the associate editor of the Journal of Learning Disabilities and president for the Center for Exceptional Children's Division for Learning Disabilities. She is the principal investigator on a multi-million-dollar grant to study the effectiveness of the response to intervention model for English language learners. And her current line of work focuses on reading comprehension strategy instruction, which is funded, I was impressed with this, mightily impressed, a $30 million I-3 grant from the U.S. Department of Education, which is a partnership with the Denver Public Schools. She has won American Educational Research Association's Early Career Award, and recently was honored by their special education special interest group for her Distinguished Career Award recipient. Now, before she talks, I have one bit of housekeeping news. Please be sure you've all signed in the back so we know how many of you all are here. And also be sure to leave your contact information so we can ask you to evaluate the event and provide information on where you can get copies or have access to the videos and handouts, which will be posted on the University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities website, which is part of our college. So with that, thank you for coming. Jeanette?
Thank you very much. It is wonderful to be here, and thank you for the weather. Very nice. Y muy buenas tardes y bienvenidos. So as you can see, I'm going to talk about a very challenging issue, distinguishing between language acquisition and learning disabilities. Now, I know many of you are in special education and know the law, but I think for those not in special education, it's very helpful to see what the law says about identifying students as having learning disabilities. So I'm not going to read all of this to you, but do want to point out what I've bolded there towards the bottom, that specific learning disability does not include learning problems that are primarily the result of visual, hearing, or motor disabilities, and then ... or of environmental, cultural, or economic disadvantage. That has been part of our identification criteria for decades now and has been referred to as the exclusionary clause. But how do we determine whether or not students' struggles, and I do focus on literacy, struggles with reading are due to environmental, cultural, or economic disadvantage or to some other reason, such as a learning disability? Now also, it's important that the child does not achieve adequately. That's what we look at, is this idea of unexpected underachievement. When provided with learning experiences and instruction appropriate for the child's age or state-approved grade level standards. So this idea of appropriate instruction or opportunity to learn is also a very important feature of the law, and again raises questions. How do we establish that an English language learner is in fact receiving a true opportunity to learn? Also part of the law, a child may not be determined to be eligible under this part, so as having a learning disability, if the determinant factor for that eligibility determination is lack of instruction in reading or math or limited English proficiency. Again, how do we figure this out? Many have thought that the way we do it is to wait until the child is fully proficient in English, but that is not the answer. There are ways to make this determination while the child is an emerging bilingual student in the process of learning English. One other aspect of the law I want to point out to you is this idea of a required observation, how important it is to observe in the child's classroom before the child is actually referred for an evaluation or afterwards. And I would suggest both, but I'll say more about that as I continue with the talk. So language acquisition or learning disability. I would argue that the single biggest error made in placing our English language learners into special education is misinterpreting language acquisition as a learning or language disability. So we must get better at making this distinction. So language acquisition or learning disability, I've put one of my books up there that is Why Do English Language Learners Struggle with Reading? And by the way, it was really supposed to be Why Do Some English Language Learners Struggle with Reading? But the publisher took out the some. So just, you know, it's important that we're just talking about a subset of our English language learners. So to a large extent, determining whether an English language learner has a learning disability is a process of elimination. So we must consider many factors and rule them out as possible reasons for the child's struggles. So if we think back to that exclusionary clause, it's this idea of excluding possible alternative explanations for the child's struggles. But we have to understand enough about what those possible alternative explanations might be in order to do that, because there are multiple explanations for every behavior. And also we need to keep in mind there are no tests that by themselves can definitively tell us whether a student has learning disabilities. When Beth Harry and I conducted our research on disproportionate representation in South Florida schools, teachers would tell us that they were referring their students for a special ed evaluation and that the tests would tell us whether or not the student really has LD or not. This belief in the scientific nature of the process. Well, of course, tests help us, but by themselves, there aren't any sort of magic tests that say, yes, that's what it is or not. So, therefore, it is important to understand the second language acquisition process. I believe that every teacher really needs to have much more coursework in second language acquisition before they enter a classroom. Gone are the days when we could say, oh, I'm not going to teach those kids and focus only on teaching monolingual students. Really, we all need to be prepared and understand oral language, written language, literacy, and what can be confusing, and that's something I'll say more about. We also need to understand the possible characteristics associated with learning disabilities, and we need to look at the quality of instruction and students' opportunities to learn, which means getting into classrooms. Now, I'm going to share an example with you. This example is from my work in South Florida. This happened to be a student who spoke Haitian Creole in a South Florida school. James was at ESOL Level 1 in Florida. They use ESOL as English for speakers of other languages, and Level 1 would be at a very beginning level. Now, the teacher says, my real concern is that when I give a direction in English, he gives me a blank look, like he doesn't understand, he's lost. She also noted that he had difficulty paying attention. Now, the assistant principal said, well, a lot of children in ESOL have these difficulties. The teacher said, but I think it's more than that. It's more a matter of higher level thinking. So this was accepted by the team, and they proceeded to refer the student for an evaluation. They did not discuss his native language skills and whether he exhibited these same problems in Haitian Creole. Now, this story we know is far too common. There have been multiple research studies published looking at the criteria used for identifying English language learners for special ed, but that's actually not why I'm showing this example to you. What I'd like you to see is the classroom James came from. Now, I was the researcher who sat in on this child study team meeting and also observed his teacher about 12 times. And she, I have to say, was a nice person. She was doing her best. When I saw her instruction, I couldn't help but think that we in teacher education had not prepared her sufficiently. This was a high-need inner-city school. What she's teaching about here is the 5 senses, and she says, the last sense is the sense of touch. That means you feel the floor with your elbows. Can you feel it? OC means observers' comments, and what I wrote was that the students didn't understand what to do. There were no visual cues. Now, anyone who knows anything about teaching English language learners knows how important it is to have visual cues, actual objects, demonstrations, etc. It can be really fun to teach about the 5 senses. But that's not what I was observing. The teacher yells, some of you are being extremely rude. Then she asked more calmly, so did you feel the floor with your elbows? But do you normally feel with your elbows? A few students responded no. The teacher yells again, you just finished telling me you were listening, Ezekiel. Were you lying to me? I'm only going to call on those students who are listening. Then she says, if I wanted to eat cake, what sense would I use? My point is, and ... And then she yells again, pay attention to me, not his shoes. His shoes aren't going to give you a grade, I will. If one more student touches shoes, I'm going to throw them in the garbage, etc. So this was a pretty typical lesson for her. And by the way, she was not that different from the teacher next door and the teacher next door, though I do want to say there were some outstanding teachers in this building, and we won't go into more about that. But the point I want to make here is that no one observed in her classroom. No one looked to see the quality of instruction she was providing and whether or not James was truly getting an opportunity to learn. She referred a third of her students to the child study team, and most of them ended up being placed in special education. And then we wonder why we have overrepresentation. Now, this might be a fairly extreme example, but not so much. I mean, I think that it really does illustrate this idea of going into classrooms and how important that is. And I will share with you another example in a bit. What I'd like to do now is talk about some of the challenges around this idea of distinguishing between LD and language acquisition. I would say first that there are many misconceptions about second language acquisition. And so what I raise are, what should teachers understand about this process? Now, first of all, I think it's important to understand the idea of sequential bilinguals and simultaneous bilinguals. And I think this is a bit of a false dichotomy, by the way. I mean, I think it's really sort of more of a continuum, but I think the principle is still an important one for us to consider. Sequential bilinguals are those we typically think of, who learn one language at home first and then learn English later when they go to school. So there's one, then another in a sequential fashion. But yet so many of our students are actually simultaneous bilinguals, meaning that they learn one, two, or more languages in the home first before starting school. They are emerging bilinguals in the process of learning multiple languages at a time. And the reality is we don't understand enough about that process. Our tests aren't designed to look at what it's like to become bilingual. And so we tend to make errors in judgment about kids using norms created with monolingual students in English or Spanish or another language. So when students are sequential bilinguals, it is not hard to determine whether or not they are experiencing difficulties in their first language as well as English. And that's important. We do have to establish that that is the case. When students are simultaneous bilinguals, though, it is much more challenging to determine if the difficulties children are experiencing are the result of language acquisition or LD. So we need a new way to think about this process of simultaneous language acquisition. For those of you who know Sylvia Linen Thompson, I was just on a conference call with her this morning, and she was talking about this and work she and others are doing on their RTI for ELL's project around trying to figure out what this should look like. So here are some misconceptions for us to consider. The first is that semilingualism is a valid concept and non-classifications are useful categories. Now, back when I was a bilingual special education teacher, which I was for 10 years, by the way, we talked about kids in this way, that they were limited in both languages. Now, the work I really like to refer to here is Jeff McSwan's, for those of you who might know it. And he refers to semilingualism and non categories as being the results of tests that do not adequately measure the full range and depth of language proficiencies among emerging bilingual students. And what he did was take students who had been classified as limited and gave them oral language samples, or asked them to tell wordless picture books, the frog stories, and then came up with a way to rate their language and found that they all spoke the language of their community, with just a few exceptions, about the same percentage you would expect in any sample of students. So it's important to consider that children who are learning two languages are going to look a little differently. And I'll give you a quick example that's a little more concrete or down to earth. Let's imagine we have a little kindergartner who is in the process of acquiring two languages. And we give him the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test in English. And we compare how he does with a monolingual English speaker. And we find that he is limited. He knows fewer words on that test. We then give him the Spanish version of the test. We find again he looks limited, and we say, oh, limited. But if we look at the total number of words that child knows, it's actually greater than what a monolingual child in either language knows. So it changes the way we think about this idea. Next, assessment and instructional frameworks developed for monolingual students are appropriate for English language learners. Now, I am familiar with the IES practice guide. I would bet some of you are also, where Russell Gersten and co-authors make the point that we can use the same frameworks, the same materials, etc. I feel that that's really dangerous, and I'll tell you why. Yes, absolutely there are similarities. Yes, but there are important differences. And when we don't also emphasize the differences, what happens is that when teachers teach the same way with the same materials using the same tests, and their English language learners don't do as well, what conclusions do they draw? There's something wrong with the kids. They don't challenge themselves or question their own instruction. Rather, they think it's something about the child. So we need to help teachers understand what is the same, because yes, of course there are things the same, but also what's different. 3, the majority of ELLs in the US are sequential bilinguals. In fact, they actually are simultaneous bilinguals, meaning they're second generation, third generation, and so forth. Another misconception is that all English language learners learn English in the same way at about the same rate, and that this is related to intelligence. I have only to look at my husband and myself as an example of this. I do speak Spanish, but it took me forever through school and minoring in Spanish in college and living abroad, and I was a bilingual teacher. My husband started learning Spanish when he was 40 and speaks better than I do, and it's not fair. But, you know, there are a lot of factors that affect how we learn another language. Not just our motivation and interest, but a lot goes into it, so we need to keep that in mind. 5, errors are problematic and should be avoided. Errors are actually a positive sign the student is making progress. They're part of interlanguage. So just as young children acquire a first language and overgeneralize grammatical rules, we see students generalizing rules from one language to another. It's important that we provide a safe space for students where they're comfortable trying out that language they're learning. Number 6, ELLs are not ready to engage in higher level thinking until they learn basic skills. Now this one, I'll bet you're looking at that and thinking, oh, I know that, but I can't tell you how many classrooms I've gone into where the English language learners are sitting over in the corner copying from the book or copying from the board as if they cannot participate in what's going on in the class, and they can. It's our job to provide the supports to help them to do that, because they are every bit as smart and capable as their fully proficient peers. When they're not demonstrating that competence, it's because we're not providing them with access to do that. Number 7, acquiring more than one language at a time is confusing. Well, actually, not really. There are studies showing that even infants can distinguish between different languages from a very young age. And we know that kids around the world do speak more than one language, grow up multilingual. So challenge 2, the characteristics of students with LD can be similar to those of English language learners acquiring English as a second language. How do we tell the difference? So let me just talk a little bit about some of this chart. Let me see how I'm doing here. What you can see on the left are behaviors associated with learning disabilities, and we can see characteristics such as difficulty following directions, difficulty with phonological awareness, slow to learn sound symbol correspondence, difficulty remembering sight words, and so on. And we know, by the way, that students with learning disabilities are a very heterogeneous group, so any given child is going to demonstrate some characteristics and not others. Now, on the right, you'll see behaviors associated with acquiring a second language. So we have difficulty following directions in English when they're not well understood, and plus the cognitive load is higher. difficulty distinguishing between sounds not in the first language. Now we know phonological awareness is so important and a predictor of later reading. Did you note, though, that it is virtually impossible, or at least very difficult, to distinguish auditorily between sounds not in your language? So if you haven't learned those sounds yet, then you are not going to be able to tell the difference between them. So we as teachers or others need to make sure to find out what sounds exist, don't exist in the child's first language. And there are tools out there available to us, such as Jill Kressa's Book of Lists, the ESL Teacher's Book of Lists, that has the phonemes in lots of different languages and which phonemes in English are not present in that language. So there are things we can do. And I think what's so important here is that, yes, of course, we still do phonological awareness activities. That is important. But we don't misinterpret why our students might be struggling. We teach them the sounds they need to learn, and we take that into account when we're making a determination about their phonological awareness skills. Next, confusion with sound symbol correspondence when different than in the first language. We know that letters can look the same and have similar sounds or sound very differently. And if we take the case of Spanish, the vowel sounds, for example, are very different and notoriously confusing for kids. Difficulty remembering sight words. We know that it's much more difficult to remember something that's abstract, that doesn't connect with an existing schema. We know that our English language learners don't always understand the meaning of the words they're being asked to learn, and then therefore it's much more difficult for them to remember them. So we could sort of go on and on. I will tell you a good source for this is the August and Shanahan report that was done looking at all of the research on learning to read in English as a second language, where they point out the research on these different factors. Challenge 3. Current LD identification models in RTI are based on assessing how well students respond to research-based intervention. But what does it mean for instruction to be research-based for ELLs? Now, this slide has been getting a lot of play, by the way. I'm the one who came up with it, but I have seen it all over the place now. But I think the point's really important, and so I'm going to go ahead and share it with you. The RTI is based on the principle that instruction or interventions are based on scientific research about what works. But it's not enough to just ask what works in a general sense. We must ask what works with whom, for what purposes, and in what contexts, because not all children learn the same way, and one size does not fit all. So we must make sure the practice we're considering using with our students has actually been validated or tried out and found to be effective with similar students. One important example here is that the National Reading Panel report that became the basis for No Child Left Behind, for Reading First, did not address issues relevant to second language learning. And the reason for that was this panel by that August and Shanahan led were going to be coming along after that. And they looked at the body of research on learning to read in English as a second language. We also know that English language learners are often omitted from participant samples. I still go to conference presentations where the presenters will say they left out the ELLs because they didn't want to mess up their findings. They wanted to know what worked without worrying about language proficiency. And yet language dominance and proficiency obviously are very important research variables and do affect treatment outcomes. So what that means is if we leave out ELLs, then we cannot generalize the findings of that study as if it applied to ELLs. Also with whom we need to be sure to include sufficient information about students' language proficiency, ethnicity, life and educational experiences, and data should be disaggregated to show how interventions might differentially affect students from diverse backgrounds. We also need to look at who is implementing the approach, how much training is required, etc. And we also need to look at the outcomes, the purposes of instruction, and the goal. So some widely touted instructional approaches actually help improve word identification, but not necessarily reading comprehension. And I've had friendly conversations with colleagues who say, well, what's wrong with improving word ID? Nothing, nothing, but it is not the end-all and be-all. We really need to see those gains translate to changes in reading comprehension. And as I'm sure many of you know, according to the Reading First impact study, Reading First did not have statistically significant impacts on reading comprehension in grades 1 through 3. Context also vary tremendously. I don't know how many of you have read Jonathan Kozol, for example, just demonstrating the tremendous disparities in resources provided to schools. I also like to think about the first grade studies conducted back in the 1960s, before some of you were born, I would imagine, where the federal government once and for all wanted to answer the question, what is the best way to teach beginning reading? And they put a lot of money into comparing different approaches. And what they found was actually more variation within programs, so across teachers and schools, than the programs themselves. So teachers really matter, the contexts matter. So we need to ask what it is about the system facilitating or impeding learning. Why is all of this important? Because we make judgments about kids based on all of this information. We must observe in classrooms to see if the instruction is appropriate for students' language and learning needs, to get a sense for the relationship between the teacher and students, how the teacher promotes interest and motivation, because we draw different conclusions when several students struggle rather than just a few. And I'm going to skip this one just because I want to be sure to have enough time. I could talk about research all day. I actually am really a research sort of junkie, but the point really is that we can learn a lot from different types of research. I'm a quantitative researcher, a qualitative researcher. I like mixed methods the most, but I'll leave it at that. So with RTI, if a child does not make adequate progress with research-based instruction that is presumed to work, we tend to make judgments about the child, or I might add, the child's family, as Beth Harry and I often heard. So how do we ensure that the child has in fact received culturally and linguistically responsive, appropriate quality instruction? As with earlier identification criteria, we must establish children are receiving an opportunity to learn. So I'm going to show you one example, and I actually have quite a few, but I'm just going to show you one. That's all I've put in the presentation. What's important here is that this instruction was by a teacher who felt that she was a successful teacher who used research-based instruction. So just keep that in mind. I mean, we can argue about whether it is or not, but she thought it was. She had been teaching at this particular school for a while and had felt pretty successful, but the population in the community was changing, more and more English language learners. Most of the students in her class now are ELLs at beginning levels of English proficiency. This is a first grade class, and this is what was observed, not by me, but my doctoral student at the time, Michael Orozco, who is now at the University of California, Riverside. The whole class is sitting in a circle, the teacher at the head, and she says, yesterday, how many of you knew your sight words? One student speaks out. 1, another 3, the teacher replies, you are right. 3 students were able to tell me their sight words. We need to practice these words. We are really behind. Every one of you should know these words by now. You need to practice these at home. Don't you practice these at home? And she's doing this with increasing frustration in her voice. And then states, only those 3 students will be able to pull from the treasure chest. So she begins sight word practice. She holds up the flashcards, and the same student is repeating them. And so finally she says, she tells that student not to repeat them, and then just a few students haltingly repeat them. And at the end she says, okay guys, you need to practice these at home. You were not paying attention. Now how many of you here think it's that they weren't paying attention? I hear that a lot. You're not paying attention, you're not listening. That's not what was happening. You should have known these words by now. So again, what I want you to think about is whether or not these kids are getting an opportunity to learn. If I had more time, I would show you an example from the reading interventionist. I would show you an example from the special education teacher, which, by the way, some people would argue is the most concerning. What's clear is that the kids really aren't getting an opportunity to learn, and they are being identified as having learning disabilities and placed in special ed. Challenge 4. Some recommendations emphasize the similarities between learning to read in English as a first or second language without getting into the differences, as I mentioned earlier. And so there are important differences. Also, I think it's important for us to consider that learning trajectories for emerging simultaneous bilinguals are not well understood, something I mentioned before. And benchmarks and expected rates of progress might not be quite the same. Many ELLs have a gap between their English word reading and their word knowledge and comprehension, something I'll demonstrate in a moment. And I would argue, too, that some recommendations put too much emphasis on phonological awareness and letter naming at the expense of other skills, such as oral language, vocabulary, and comprehension. Now, I don't know how many of you know Noni Lasso's work, but I'm a big fan of hers. This, or I should say these data, are actually from a study she conducted in San Diego, so Southern California. And what I'd like you to notice is on the left, you can see word reading scores. These are all for English language learners. And what you can see for accuracy and decoding is that the kids are pretty much at sort of an average level. They get there. They can figure out how to decode. But look what happens with their oral language. We have a significant gap there, and I would argue that this is because we are not focusing enough on oral language or on comprehension, that those also are very important skills for us to be emphasizing even in kindergarten. It's not either or, it's both, or all of the above, and it can be done. So lots of factors influence reading for English language learners. We know reading skills, oral proficiency. By the way, we used to think that you had to be proficient in oral language before you could learn to read. We now know there's a reciprocal relationship. And actually, some of the most exciting programs are those where kids are learning to read in English and Spanish at the same time. We know interest and motivation are very important, the learning context, the teacher skills, and yes, the instructional practice. But as you can see, there are a lot of factors in addition to just the practices. Challenge 5, how can we tell which English language learners to refer for a special ed evaluation? What information do we need to make that decision? So when a child shows signs of struggling, the first step should be to observe in her classroom. Is instruction targeted to and appropriate for her level of English proficiency and learning needs? Is the teacher implementing the appropriate research-based practice with fidelity? And if the teacher is modifying the practice, why? For what reasons? Sometimes teachers make changes for very good reasons, and so I am a believer in fidelity. I'm up to my ears in fidelity right now with my reading comprehension approach in Denver Public Schools. But yet, I think we need to, well, as I say, it's a big topic for another day, or you can ask me a question about it. And then we need to make sure the classroom environment is conducive to learning. So this, I think, is very important. Are most of the students' true peers succeeding? Now, I know that's hard to do when you don't have a lot of true peers, but hopefully as you work with this over time and you develop local norms and really get a sense for how kids are doing, you can answer this question. So we look at how many English language learners are struggling. If the majority are making little progress, then the focus should be on improving instruction. So my work with RTI, we do a ton of work around what the core universal instruction should look like, because if you don't have that foundation, it's very difficult to make decisions about which students should receive Tier 2. Now, if most ELLs are doing well, then we zero in and we look more closely at that student. And this slide, I have George Batch to thank and David Tilley. This is letter naming fluency risk level overview, and these are kindergarten classrooms. On the left, you can see the total kindergarten, and then you can see the different kindergartens at that school spread across this slide. Now, this is probably pretty typical, right? It probably doesn't surprise you. We wouldn't expect every teacher to have exactly the same scores. But let's consider this. Let's assume, or let's say, that the English language learners have been randomly assigned across all these classrooms. So what would we say about classroom 22? She's doing a really good job, right? We want to get in there and find out what she's doing because it seems to be working really well. What would we say about 14? She needs some help. Could be a new teacher. Maybe we'll pair her up with the, other teacher next door. Now let's say that the English language learners are all in one classroom. Now, which classroom do you think they might be in? So they might be in 14. Now, what conclusion do we draw? Do we think it's the kids? Something's wrong with those kids? See, they just can't learn, and which I hear, by the way. Or do we think that the instruction must not be a good fit? I mean, if you think about school and kindergartners walking through our door, our goal should be to meet them at least halfway, right? Figure out what they know, what they need to learn, what we're going to build on. And sometimes I think there is a mismatch. If instruction seems appropriate and most ELLs in the class are thriving, the next step is to collect student data. Now, I'm not going to go through all of this because I want to get to an example before we finish up. But I do want to make this point. We need multiple assessments to provide a comprehensive view of learning. There's no single best test or assessment strategy, which I'm sure many in the room here know better than I do. And different assessments tap into different skills. Assessments should be used only for the purpose for which they were designed. We often use language proficiency tests, for example, for more than that with our English language learners. Now, this is also from Noni Lasso. She and I have done some work together, so I borrowed her slides with permission. And this is a common scenario, early literacy measures. So what you can see in bold across the top, or I should say highlighted in yellow, are letter names and letter sounds, phonological awareness, word reading, accuracy, and efficiency. So those are useful. It helps us to find out how students are doing with those skills. When we progress monitor, that's typically what we do, right? But really that just is the starting point because so much goes into reading. And as Sheila Valencia, who we were talking about, likes to point out, children with the very same OR for oral reading fluency score can have widely varying needs. So if we think about reading comprehension as the sine qua non of reading, and we look at all the skills that go into that, oral language, metalinguistic skills, text characteristics, background knowledge, etc., we get that we really need to find out more to be able to provide students with appropriate instruction and to make a determination about why they might be struggling. Now, I want to finish with a case study. This is a true story. This student I taught way back a long time ago when I was a teacher. This was in Santa Cruz, California. And I had been teaching in San Jose and was recruited to set up bilingual special ed programs in Santa Cruz. And Marta had been placed in my program before I got there. Now, her second grade teacher had referred her for a special ed evaluation because of a lack of academic progress, particularly in reading. Based on the results of their battery of tests, the IEP, or Individualized Educational Plan, or program team considered her to be low in both her home language, Spanish and English. They believed that she had auditory processing deficits and showed a significant discrepancy between her IQ and achievement. Back then, we needed to figure out a processing deficit, by the way. Now, she had been in a bilingual program and received instruction in Spanish in kindergarten. Then she moved and received instruction in English only for first and second grades. Her parents described her as intelligent, very helpful with her younger siblings. They were concerned she wasn't doing better and very much trusted the school's judgment that their daughter needed special education. So when she became my student, I assessed her in both Spanish and English using the Brigance. I don't know how many of you remember the Brigance, but a very useful tool as a teacher. And I made the decision in collaboration with others to provide her with Spanish literacy instruction, as well as intensive oral English language development. I used the language experience approach, which I love, by the way, which probably isn't really a research-based approach, but I don't think it's ever truly been tested. It's a study I still want to do. So she dictated stories to be in Spanish that she learned how to read and took off, gaining 2 grade levels in Spanish reading in just a few months. She expressed a strong interest in learning to read in English, and so in February I began English literacy instruction. I continued to use the language experience approach, and I added DISTAR, and I have to tell you that because I am in Oregon, but I used DISTAR with her as well, plus thematic units based on interest, which were a huge hit, which I would tell you more about if I had time. By June, she was on grade level in English and above grade level in Spanish. We reassessed her eligibility for special ed and found she was ineligible. So she was exited from the program. So I asked, is she a success story? Yes, but did she really need to be in special education in the first place? So how can we make sure not to misidentify English language learners like Marta? So in conclusion, distinguishing between LD and language acquisition is a complicated process requiring a comprehensive approach to assessment that evaluates the societal and educational context within which the child has developed. Lots of different factors. And we must shift from a within-child deficit paradigm to an eco-behavioral perspective, and that from the National Association of School Psychologists. Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm just dying of heat up here. I'm going to take that off. So we have a little bit of time for questions, I believe. Is that right? Great. So we have 2 mics, one at either side. So if you have a question and would like to approach a mic.
Can you talk a little bit about students who lose their first language before they gain their second language? Internationally adopted students, some other students who are no longer living within their first language, and how that impacts the assessment, because you talked about it as if there were only 2. And
Right. Yes, absolutely, that's the case also. We know that that is quite common, and I think something that also does need to be considered. Are you referring to the assessment process more, or?
Well, I guess my real question is, what do you do after, when they have lost their first language, they're being taught solely in English, and they're testing out of ELL, but still have the deficiencies that you're talking about in terms of the language acquisition?
So I would still see what I could find out about that language, because sometimes we think students have lost a language, but it's sort of in there, and it is helpful to find out more about it. I think that, it's sort of hard to make a generic statement about what to do exactly, but I do think this idea of a comprehensive assessment where we look at a variety of factors, including the child's previous experiences, strengths as well as concerns. Something I didn't go into today because I knew I wouldn't have time is how we actually conduct that comprehensive assessment, but I think that there's a lot that we can do to find out what's really going on with that child. Okay, thank you. Good point.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. I have a question. What do you think about using non-word repetition tasks in the child's native language? I'm thinking like of a school-age child to try to determine if there is a problem with the language acquisition system, language learning system, using non-word repetition in the native language. Do you use that in your research at all?
I haven't used that. I mean, I think that that can be useful. I actually, well, I was on the bilingual assessment team in Santa Cruz, but what I did was all of the sort of academic assessment, and the speech language therapist did more what you're talking about, I think. But I don't know that I'm really giving you a very good answer.
Yeah, because I think that it's a key issue is whether or not there is a disorder like specific language impairment, because that's closely linked with learning disabilities and reading problems. And so if they do fairly well on non-word repetition tasks as a preschool or young school-age child, then at least you have some assurance that they don't have specific language impairment, that, in other words, the language learning system is within normal limits. I think that's a key question.
Yeah, I think, you know what, there's the whole idea of false positives, negatives, and I think that if the child does well on that, that's a good indication. But if the child does not, we have to be careful how we interpret that, because it could be a lack of experience, lack of prior schooling. You know, we don't really know for sure. We would need to find out a little bit more. I do think that natural language samples, such as with the frog stories, can be very useful for trying to get children to draw from their full linguistic repertoire. And I think that in combination with what you're talking about could be useful. But I would say yes, and with a caveat. Thanks.
Thank you.
Is that it?
Hello. My kind of aha during your presentation was the observational piece when before you're referring in that pre-process, because my district has a flow chart of what we do, but we send a questionnaire to the classroom teachers, but we don't actually go in and observe. So that was interesting to me, and I thought, is there a survey or a checklist that we could modify to fit our district's need that you would recommend?
Yes, actually there are things I could send. Let's see. Zakarian, her last name is, she actually has a useful observation tool in her book. We've developed one for our RTI for ELL's project I could share with you as well. So I think I'm going to be sending information, and I could send that. Something I think is important in what you're saying. Oh, now I'm going to forget. Oh, well, I can't remember. But yes, just how really important that observation. Oh, I know what it was. I do think something that is encouraging about RTI is that the culture is changing. We used to shut the door and be on our own with our students without a lot of collaboration. And I think more and more we are recognizing the need to collaborate with others, whether it's with the reading interventionist or the ESL teacher, and more shared coaching, peer observing. And I think that that is all really helpful. So it's this idea of supporting one another without it being part of a formal evaluation. And I think that sort of helps set the climate for this.
So I have a question regarding if you've done any of the research. It seems like students with deafness are often left out of ELL language and conversation, and particularly students who don't acquire a true first language because they've been taught in an auditory instruction. And I wonder if any of your research or any of your thoughts have looked at that.
So you mean they haven't learned ASL?
Correct. So they've been denied ASL up into a certain age, and then they're designated as learning disabled or having a disability.
So I haven't, but one of my doctoral students is very interested in this. Her name is Debbie Golos, and she's at at Utah State University, and I can get you more information. I know that from her that this is really a sort of hot topic in the community, and I could find out more for you if you'd like.
So Jeanette, I'd like to ask questions as a proxy for many of my students. A couple of things, if you could just say more about how the process might look different for students who speak languages other than Spanish, in particular non-Romance languages or non-Germanic languages, how that might be different, and also if you have any thoughts or experience with secondary ELL students, so how that might also look different.
So in terms of these sort of general principles, I think that they really apply. Of course, the specifics of how they play out are going to vary depending on the community and how many other children speak that language. One point I really want to make about Marta is I could tell which students had a learning disability. So, you know, when you are a teacher, and you're a good teacher, and you are effective, and most of your kids really gain well under your tutelage, you really do get a sense for which kids have a true learning disability. And I have to say, because I was successful with most students, when I had a few who no matter what I did, you know, just couldn't quite get it, or they would know it and then forget it, etc., I could really tell. And I think that's what we're aiming at, regardless of what the language is. For classrooms where most kids are thriving, because then we can make a determination about those few kids who aren't. Now, the question about secondary school, my research with reading comprehension is in secondary schools and inclusive classrooms as well as special ed classrooms, though that's not really this issue. So, I mean, I think you still need to think about these same principles. I will say that one challenge we have with older kids are the long-term ELLs. And the idea of long-term ELLs, for those of you who might not be familiar with that term, is kids who actually start in our schools at kindergarten, first grade, and get to middle school, high school, and still have not been reclassified. And what I think is that those, in many cases, are our simultaneous bilingual kids for whom our instruction just hasn't been appropriate enough. So I think we do get these kids who have sort of a history of failure, of not doing well, and it does become very hard to tease out what's actually going on. Thanks.
Thank you for your talk today. I really appreciated your comments about observations as a school psych, not just for ELLs, but also you get a behavioral recommendation and you go into the classroom and the pacing of instruction is so slow you get bored. You think, oh, these poor kids. And not to, you know, bash teachers. I love teachers. I'm married to a teacher. So, but I do really appreciate talking about the importance of observations. I know you didn't have time today, because you never have time to cover everything in a talk, about a comprehensive evaluation, but do you have any resources to direct us to some examples? I would love to see what a true best practice comprehensive examination or comprehensive evaluation.
I'd be happy to send you more. We do talk about it a little more in that book, that Why Do English Language Learners Struggle with Reading. There is a chapter in there, though I think honestly it's probably a little outdated. But I can send you more. Julia Esparza Brown, who's at Portland State, I actually think is doing some pretty good work around this. She would be one resource. There's some good work coming out of UT Austin as well. I think we're getting better at assessing language proficiency, and I think that really helps. So also Cal, the Center for Applied Linguistics and such. So I can send you some resources if you'd like.
That'd be wonderful. Thank you.
And actually, you've got my email address right there, and do feel free to email me. I truly would be happy to hear from you. Don't call me. I didn't put my phone number up. I'm horrible at phone calls. But email, I will get to it. I will respond, and I can send you some resources if you'd like. Now, the presentation, I believe we're going to post. Is that right? Yes. But I can also, you know, send you some other references, etc.
I just have another question. Could you back up to your slides where you had the predictive factors for reading? It was, let's see.
This one?
Well, no, you had the predictive factors. You had oral language, and you broke out vocabulary and.
Oh, you mean the assessment slide? Yeah.
Yeah.
This one?
There you go. I was wondering what assessment measures you used to look at oral language, and I'm assuming this is for ELL children. The testing that you've done here?
You know, this is in general.
Okay.
This slide is meant to reflect in general, but how it can be particularly.
Okay. All right. Then my question has to do with oral language.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to point out that research with monolingual English-speaking children with typical language and impaired, various gradations of impairment, shows that comprehension and use of complex syntax is just as important as vocabulary knowledge, and it's often under-recognized with English language learners. Yeah. So especially when you get into 4th grade and you've got expository text comprehension, that's when children really start struggling, and a lot of that has to do with the complexity of the sentences. They become extremely long and have multiple levels of embedding. So it's not just vocabulary, even though there's a big emphasis on
Yes,
teaching
that's a really good
vocabulary.
point. Yeah, thank you. That's up there, isn't it? Yeah, but we could put more. That's a good point. Thank you.
I have a question.
Sure.
What do you think about the validity of using nonverbal tests to assess the cognitive capacity or whatever of ELL students when the tester is not a bilingual person?
Yeah, I used to give the Ravens progressive matrices. I mean, that was when we used to give nonverbal. I mean, they say that every test has a verbal component to it, you know, whether it's just the directions. I think that something to keep in mind with assessments is it's not just the language, but the culture as well. And even tasks like those on the Ravens, just to use an example, are still culturally embedded, you know, and there's been some fascinating research out there on different skills children who grow up in different communities excel at as compared with, you know, the sort of mainstream society here. So it's messier than just language, and I didn't make that point before, but I think is important. It isn't to say that we would use those, but I think we have to do it with a lot of caution and really be aware that it's just one piece of a much larger puzzle.
Thank you.
Thanks. Anybody else? I think that's it. Well, thank you all.